Hello and welcome to the Rhythm Changes podcast. I'm your host, Will Chernoff, and the Vancouver International Jazz Festival is coming up very, very, very soon. You can catch me kicking off the festival with Chris Wong in an hour-long conversation for free about his book, Journeys to the Bandstand 30 Jazz Lives in Vancouver, at Ocean Artworks on Friday, June 21st at 4 p.m. All the great stuff from the Jazz Fest is to follow, but you can join us for the very beginning. Listen to us talk for another hour if you've already heard the 2 hours on this show. We're going to be doing it again. It's going to be so much fun. I can't wait for the 2024 Jazz Fest, and it's a great way to get it started. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you to the Coastal Jazz and Blues Society for having me. All right. Well, as we allude to in this one, this is an episode that's been a long time in the making. I've been going to Brentwood a fair bit with Brian Fraser. He's been on this show. I've been really inspired by him, and he's been supporting me a lot. And this is a person I met through Brentwood, and I've learned more about. He has gone through a lot of shifts in terms of his role in this community over the last couple years. And now he's doing something very cool that I'm learning a lot about in this conversation. Here we go. Our guest today is a clarinet player. He works at St. Andrew's Wesley United Church in downtown Vancouver, known as the home of Jazz Vespers, which is a type of service that has spread across the Lower Mainland and exists in this much broader world that I'm looking forward to hearing more from him about. You may know him from his performances under the name Grand Slam Jazz Band and for playing with people who have roots in the trad jazz and hot jazz swing scene in the Lower Mainland over the last decade or so. And he's hosting me in his office on site at St. Andrew's Wesley. So please welcome to the Rhythm Changes podcast, Ben MacRae.
Oh, thank you so much, Will. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let's start with talking about Jazz Vespers in British Columbia. So as some of your listeners may know from the podcast with Brian Fraser, Jazz Vespers came to British Columbia in the early 90s. At that time, St. Andrew's Wesley had started declining for a period. Its membership had kind of gone down, and they were trying to figure out different ways of revitalizing the city and speaking to what was going on in Vancouver at that time. And so Reverend Dr. Gordon Turner, who was a jazz trombonist as well as a minister, he, in his sabbatical in 1993, went to St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran in New York City. And he experienced this whole Jazz Vespers thing, which had started in the late 60s. And he decided to bring it back to Vancouver. And so here we are, 30 years later. Yeah.
Yeah, because I often go to Brentwood these days. Brian has been such a huge supporter of Rhythm Changes. I love going there. I've played there recently. I've come to St. Andrew's Wesley a few times over the years. Brentwood's a lot closer to where I live. So I've ended up there a lot more often. But through Brian, too, I've heard about and I've managed to catch sometimes on the gig list at Rhythm Changes the other churches that are doing it now. And even though you said, it's come to Vancouver in a solid fashion 30 plus years ago, it seems like now still it's still kind of spreading a little bit more into some other churches, right?
Yeah. Jazz Vespers seems to be most common in what we call the mainline churches, so Presbyterian, Anglican, United. Although we're starting to see it actually a little bit more commonly in the evangelical churches around here as well. But yeah, it's no longer just kind of a United Church or St. Andrew's Wesley thing. It's become a big part of the culture around here. And it's something that not every city has. As I've traveled through Canada and parts of the US, not every city has, 12, 13, 14, 15 churches doing this. And I think at last count, when I was looking across British Columbia, there's something about like 20 churches that run this either as a weekly program, monthly, or quarterly, somewhere around there. It's become a big thing.
Yeah. And you came to St. Andrew's Wesley to start coordinating Jazz Vespers here relatively recently. You were involved at Brentwood before that, but I want to go a little bit further back from there because I knew of you through Brentwood mostly, I suppose. So what if we look at upbringing up to that point? You can start wherever you like. Just if you take it way back, like how does this end up being the direction you were headed in general? Because like you're a clarinet player, you're a woodwinds player. I've heard you sing as well. You're also a vocalist, and I've appreciated your music, but there's a lot I don't know about your background before all that. So where would you like to start in terms of your upbringing?
Well, I'd like to put on the record that I use the term vocalist lightly.
I used it.
I was born in southern Alberta. My family on both sides have roots in Alberta, but I grew up in British Columbia with my grandparents, mostly in Langley and Chilliwack. Family background's Dutch Canadian. It's a big part of my upbringing. And when I was growing up, I grew up with a single mother. There wasn't lots of extra money around, but I was quite musical as a child. And when I was little, I'd always wanted to get into tap dancing. And and when I was little, I had these clogs that my grandmother had given me. Actually, these ones on my shelf right here.
Oh, because it's a Dutch background.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I used to dance on the tiles when I was like 2, 3, 4 years old. And I would sing a lot at home and things like that, but we just couldn't afford any lessons or any instruments. Fast forwarding till I was about, I guess I would have been about 11 and getting ready to choose my instrument for a band. I didn't really know what most of these, woodwind, brass, percussion type instruments were that they used in school. And so I kind of like vaguely knew what a flute was. And I was like, oh, I'll play the flute. And my mom, very much a woman of her generation, was like, no, you can't play the flute. That's an instrument for girls.
Okay.
Which is horrific because we have so many excellent male flute players, and instruments have nothing to do with gender. They're
Tom Keenley side, man.
Tom Keenley side, Jeremy Price.
Yeah, Jeremy.
The list goes on and on. But not being the feminist I am now, back then I caved to the pressure. And so my mom started looking at videos of different things, and I was like, nah, I don't want to play the saxophone. That's too cheesy. And,
you were right about that.
Yeah, perhaps. And, my one of my best friends, Caden Gordon, had already picked the trumpet, and I was like, I can't be like that guy. And so I started looking at the clarinet, and I remember I was sitting at my mom's computer, and she put this video on of Benny Goodman playing Sweet Georgia Brown.
Oh yeah,
in 1989, like right at the end of his life.
Okay, late Benny Goodman.
Late Benny Goodman, and I remember just being like transfixed. I've watched that video so many times, and I decided that was the moment I was going to play the clarinet, and so that's what I chose, and got into grade 7 band, and all those years I wanted to play music, I just ate it up. I would go to school for, 6:30, 7 a.m. band practice and stay until 5 p.m. every day, and then still go home and listen to more music, more tunes. And at that time, it had just ended, but Chilliwack used to have a very strong Dixieland Jazz Festival. It's a problematic term, but that's what they called it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And although the festival had recently folded, there was still this really strong culture of traditional jazz out in the valley, which had actually gone back, I would later learn, multiple decades. And I had this a great middle school teacher who had partnered with our high school, the local high school teacher, and they together would come. They would teach us New Orleans style jazz after school every day, and I was definitely part of this kind of long lineage of traditional jazz players that came out from Chilliwack. So, one of the most notable names would be Bria Skomberg, who graduated, I think, 13 or 14 years before I did. But there's a whole bunch of players in between us along the way that I can name, people like Colin Farker and Caden Gordon and
Bonnie Northgraves.
Yeah, there's a big group of us, and I think that era is now largely closed. That program at my old high school has changed a lot.
What school was that?
Chilliwack Secondary.
Okay, yeah. So how much overlap was there with Bonnie? Because when she was on this show, she talked a little bit about that too. You imagine there's a lot of the same people.
Yeah, Bonnie,
even though she's a little older.
Bonnie would have still graduated, I think, 6 or 7 years before I did. But I went to school with her siblings, her younger siblings. So there's
Did they play too?
Yeah, some of them. Yeah, most of them actually. Most of them.
Nice.
Yeah. It was great. It was a really it was an excellent formation. It was funny though when I would move to the city, and I remember like I'd gotten into I did a couple years of music school out Kwantlen just because I wasn't quite ready to move into the city yet. Back when Kwantlen saw the music program, and I really liked classical music as well and wanted that foundation. But when I finally got to CAP after a number of years after high school, I remember I went into my first lesson with Mike Allen.
Oh yeah,
and we're sitting at the piano, and he's like, "Well, what tunes do you know?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he goes, "Do you know Star Eyes?" And I was like, "No." And he goes. And I go, I say something like, "Oh, do you know Livery Stable Blues?"
Well, they call it hot jazz tunes.
Yeah. And he's like, "No." And then he goes, "Do you know this tune?" I say, "No." And I call, "What about this one?" And we're going back and forth because he's kind of a post 50s, 60s player. And I was like pre-World War II. And finally we settle on Stardust because that was the only
there you
tune
go.
We both knew. But when I was growing up, like there was a whole bunch of us, and like even a figure like Coleman Hawkins would have been considered modern
jazz. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sounds like you and I are about the same age, but I was in and out of CAP pretty quickly. So I must have been there while you were in your Kwantlen period, because maybe you moved to the city, you're saying, like coming from the Valley and starting to feel like you're building your life in Vancouver, maybe about 10 years ago.
Yeah, about 10 years ago.
Yeah, that checks out. Yeah, Kwantlen's program, I remember when Jody Prosnick was directing there, but I remember the program was short-lived in my mind because I don't remember hearing about it for too many years before people shifted around and ended up doing other things after it closed down. Yeah.
Yeah, Jody was brought on, I think shortly after I started there.
So you were in that jazz program?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Partially. And then I kind of started to see the writing on the wall for the program.
Okay.
So I left after I got my diploma, and I went to CAP and did another 4 years there.
Yeah. So where did you move to not have a 2-hour commute to CAP? Where did you set out when you moved to the city?
So I did the gradual migration. When I was at Kwantlen, I lived with some family in Langley, and then I finally moved to North Burnaby.
Oh yeah.
Which I thought would be close enough to CAP to avoid the bridges. But it turns out that those bridges just have a mind of their own.
You can't avoid the bridges unless you move all the way up there. Yeah, but then you gotta hit them on the way back every time you go.
But then you gotta hang with people from North Van if you're out there. So
I remember doing that. I commuted for many years from New West to North Van for all kinds of reasons, and I don't really do it as much anymore. But it was a big thing that I reckoned with for several years.
One of the things I was thinking about. I'm finishing my Master's of Divinity, and this will mark 10 years that I've been in post-secondary school.
Wow.
Which when you're 27 and you've been going to school since you were in kindergarten is a long time. But I've never felt like a student over the years. I always was playing lots of gigs in a way that because of my background coming from the Valley and it being a smaller community and a much more niche scene and stuff, I think that really set me up to be a working musician in a way that a lot of my peers have had to do during the program or after. And I think at the time I was, I was pretty hot-headed about it. And I look back now and I'm just like, yeah, you could have chilled out a little bit more. But it really is something that, by the time I was, 20 or so, I was already, I'd already been teaching music for multiple years and had at one point, leading up to the pandemic, before a lot of things in my life changed, at least half of my income was coming from gigging and was working as a full-time musician.
Yeah. So you were already like teaching lessons and stuff. Yeah. On clarinet or maybe saxophone too. Or something.
And theory and composition.
Okay,
yeah. Ensemble.
So how did you end up becoming affiliated with Brentwood? Did you start going there when you moved to North Burnaby? Because you said North Burnaby.
Yeah, I mean, that part of things is a little bit more complicated. So my family's background on both sides was Roman Catholic.
Okay.
Which means we didn't go to church. And I'm joking. I'm very proud of my Roman Catholic roots. And my parents, my mom eventually married to my dad, and they were Protestant and raised us going to church. But by the time I was about 12 or so, we didn't go very often. And I was really just quite done with the whole thing. Although as a child, I was quite spiritual. But as a teenager, I was increasingly frustrated about the fact that, the music I was playing wasn't welcome. I had several friends who came out at the time. I had two friends who came out as lesbian, and it was very frustrating and upsetting to see how they were rejected from church. And at the same time, like I've always been big into science and the STEM fields, although I'm terrible at math. But it was told all of that was nonsense and, 7-day creationism and all that. And so I just kind of left it behind, and I was just busy playing tunes and playing music and going to music school, and I really didn't think much of it. However, I had moved to North Burnaby, and I was living with Noah Franchenolan, and was connected with Marcos Flo, who's a bass player that I think he's now in Bella Coola.
Okay.
He's a music teacher. Anywho, Brian had gotten funding at the time to do a survey of the spiritual profiles of jazz musicians living in Vancouver, and they did this huge survey. He could tell you more, but it was over 100 musicians, and Noah interviewed me one afternoon in a park in Burnaby, and he was like, I'm not really Christian, I'm spiritual, but I think because of your background and stuff, you should go check Brentwood out. And
that's what Noah said to you?
Yeah. And I was like, nah, I'm good. I grew up going to church, and I'm done with that shit. And I was going to school, and Marcos was hanging out there at the time. He's like, you should go check out Brentwood. It's the same thing. No, I'm good. And there was a few other connections like this. Anyways, things had been just going totally sideways in my life for quite a period. At that time, my father had died, a long-term relationship had ended, there was a health scare, there were like everything was going sideways. And for the first time in my life, my grades at school really started to tank. And
you were Kwantlen or Cap?
I was at Cap at this point. And, everything was going good. Everything was going terrible. Everything was going terrible except for my gigging life, which was really busy. But I would go to gigs, and all I wanted to do was just play like the saddest sop tunes you could think of. And I was in one of my lessons with Mike Allen, and he was like, I'm playing this show at Brentwood. And in the back of my mind, I was like, this church won't leave me alone. And he goes, we're playing John Coltrane's A Love Supreme.
Oh, yeah.
You should come check it out. And, basically to keep him quiet, I put it on my calendar and didn't think anything of it.
Okay. He does that every year
at
Brentwood.
Yeah,
still.
He does it every year.
Yeah.
And I'd gone and listened to him before, and not there, but I was like, I'll put it on the calendar, make my teacher happy. And so it was a Monday night, and I was horribly depressed. There'd been more stuff going on with my family and whatever. And I finally looked up where this church was because I had nothing better to do. And I realized it was like about a 25-minute walk. And so I walked all the way down the hill, up the hill, over to Brentwood, and went in, showed up, and Brian greeted me, was like, hey, we'd been friends on Facebook because he's a bit of a Facebook warrior, that guy. If you're listening to this, Brian, I love you. You know that.
Yeah, a lot of respect there.
And he was like, yeah, come in. And I did what any good Christian would do, and I went and sat at the very back of the church, and basically cried my eyes out for an hour straight, and then tried to leave as soon as possible. And I got about 4 or 5 steps out the front door when Pam Wong, who is their clerk of session, which in non-church speak would be like chair of the board sort of thing. She came out to me and said, I don't really know who you are or anything. She's like, can I give you a hug? And I was like, okay. And she gave me a hug. And she just said, will we see you again? And I was like, I have no idea. And I left and stayed in touch a little bit with Brian. I think he emailed me and said a couple weeks later, we'd like to hire you for a Sunday morning service to come and do a Martin Luther King Jr. service in early January. And I didn't think much of it other than agreed to do it. And it was in the early January of that following winter that I went, and I just stayed every Sunday after that.
So what year was that? That January? 2017, 18?
What year is it now? It's 2024.
Yeah.
20.
It's got to be,
it'd be 2018, 17 or 18. Yeah. And it just really stuck with me because of the jazz connection and because of Brian. It's a small congregation, but a really, really loving group. And yet is also very progressive, very thought focused. Most of the churches I've been around at that point, you'd ask a question and they'd be like, because it's church tradition or it's what the Bible says were the two answers. And anytime I asked Brian a question, he'd be like, here's 3 or 4 books, which really worked for me because I tend to have a streak of academia in me. And I was really able to integrate a lot of my musical practice with faith and spirituality. And their music director at the time was Dan Reynolds, who became like a really close friend.
And now in a twist of fate, of course, it's Noah,
and now
who introduced you to Brentwood.
Yeah. Now in a twist of fate, it's Noah. And so I stayed there and eventually became one of their music directors and was on their session, their board. And after a number of years, people kept saying to me, oh, you should go to ministry and blah, blah, blah. And, I'd kind of nod and smile when the church ladies said that, and then I'd ignore it. And then my family members started saying it, and I was like, none of you go to church. Like, finally, I'd been dating someone, and we were driving down the highway, and the windows were down, and she just like, we were listening to tunes, like, I don't know, probably something swinging, probably Mingus. And she was like, you should go to ministry. And I was like, no, stop. Not you too. And so I eventually agreed to go and do a semester after I'd gotten my bachelor's at the Vancouver School of Theology, and been there ever since. And now I'm looking at graduating in less than a year's time.
Yeah, one of the first things that I was going to ask you if I needed a new kindling before we got rolling was whether or not you wanted to talk about school or whether you needed an escape, because I know you've been immersed in it nonstop for the last months. Well, perhaps longer than that, but at least for sure over the course of this year when we've connected, I know you've just been working so hard on that.
Yeah, I think we've put off this recording 3 or 4 times.
A few months, yeah.
No, that's just fine. It's I'm at a point where it's all really coming together. In terms of how my practice as a pastor is intersecting with my love of early jazz, traditional jazz, with ministry. And I've increasingly over the years become much more involved with social justice and activism. Perhaps not as loud as some. I tend to be someone who more wants to work behind the scenes on that sort of thing. But it's all starting to come together in a way that I never thought it would, which is really exciting.
Huh. Yeah, no, I'm very excited for you, and I know you've been working super hard on it, and the closing chapter of your school's journey here is going to be an exciting moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's hard to imagine that it's going to be done so soon, but I'm also
You're ready.
I'm so ready. I'm ready until I decide to do a doctorate at some point,
right.
But we'll see. I have thoughts about what I'd like to do with that doctorate. I'd like to do something that integrates jazz and church and really goes deep into that area. I have some ties to Fifth Ave Presbyterian, First Ave Pres in New York, which is where Ellington recorded the second Sacred concert, as well as I'm thinking when I get a sabbatical in a couple of years, I'd like to look at St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran, and I've got because of a lot of these Vancouver expats that have moved to New York, many of whom, as we were talking before we start recording, are from the traditional jazz scene. There's enough connections there that I'd like to explore this connection between Vancouver and New York.
Yeah, and that's a fresh take on because I work and I spend a lot of time with Corey Weeds and Seller, and that's a Vancouver New York connection. But here's another Vancouver New York connection to develop.
Yes, for sure.
Before I ask you a bit more about coming to St. Andrews Wesley and how it's going for you right now, I wanted to linger a bit more on that 2017-18-ish time. I just want to hear about where you were playing and who you were playing with, because you were talking about, the one thing that you felt like was keeping you hanging in there was the gigging that you were doing at the time. So tell me about those times. Like I could think probably Guilt & Co. maybe would be a place on those hot jazz regular nights, but where were you playing? Who were you playing with? What was that time like at that time?
Yeah, at times I was playing at Guilt & Co. I was playing with the traditional jazz folks of our generation, and then also working with those who are 5-10 years older, as well as some of the actually especially at that time, now that I think about it, a lot of the elder members of the scene as well. So I was playing with people like Caden Gordon and others, Alvin Brendan, Dean Thiessen, Bonnie North Graves, occasionally playing with some people like Alan Matheson and Jen Hodge, also working with folks like Arndt Arnson, and occasionally I'd have some gigs with his grandfather, Lloyd Arnson, which was really special. But also folks like Rice Honeywell. I don't know if you know that.
I don't.
Yeah. So both Lloyd and Rice worked with Louis Armstrong back in the 50s. And a variety of different singers doing lots of things, playing, at Guilt and the swing dance scene, which has changed a lot in the last 10 years. Some of the venues have come back post-COVID. Some of them are gone. Used to play at a lot of restaurants in the drive, on the drive, and throughout the valley, city of Vancouver, all that stuff. Gigs in Alberta and Quebec and parts of Ontario and whatnot. I think what's changed a lot post-COVID is a lot of the musicians in that really niche trad jazz scene have left. It was really strong for a while, and then COVID has really changed how we interact with one another. And it's only just been this year that I've started feeling like the swing dance scene is actually kind of back to pre-pandemic levels. And even then, there's not as many dances as there were. But I actually kind of like the dances more now because they're more packed, even if there are fewer.
Yeah, fewer events, more concentrated.
Yeah.
That's an interest. That is a trend right now that I perceive as well. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, it probably is for the best.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, and the question is compared to what, right? Like you could say it's better compared to this, and you could say it's worse compared to that. So who knows if it really matters? But
yeah,
we all have our different like reference points of what we compare it to. Like for me, I compare a lot of the stuff now to when I was playing the most jazz, which was like maybe 2013, 14, 15. And then I had several years away where I kind of disappeared from the scene a bit before I came back by starting Rhythm Changes. But I compare a lot of the stuff now to that 10-ish years ago time. And obviously it looks way better to me now. But if you zoom in on a couple of sub scenes, or if you take a few different years as like what you're comparing it to, maybe not, right? So it's an inexact thing to feel that out, to feel how different it is now. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And was playing, a lot of this traditional jazz. I had developed a love for modern jazz in those years as well. And, I really like free jazz. It's funny. I think I've gotten pigeonholed in the scene at times for just being like, honky tonk clarinet player.
Part of that is just playing clarinet, right?
Part of it's just playing clarinet, but I like a lot of free jazz and the more avant-garde parts of the scene. But I also in those years started playing with klezmer bands, which is really funny because I play in a group of them now. There's a few different bands I play under with. I'm not a band leader, just sidemen. And frequently I'm the only person born in Canada, the only person that isn't Jewish and is actively a Christian, which is really, really funny. I've played at a few synagogues where someone's come up to me and asked if I'm Jewish. And it's like, no, other than my name, nothing about me is Jewish.
That's so funny to hear you say that, because I've heard that said so much about Dave Douglas, the trumpet player, who I've been a fan of and, been involved with a bit in previous years. And, him with John Zorn and with all those other things. And he has that deep connection. He's Christian and he's not Jewish. He's the non-Jewish person in the room too when he goes and does all that. Yeah. I don't mind being the token goy from time to time. It's a real pleasure, and it's really helped deepen my understanding of my instrument and the Hebraic parts of Christianity. And there's been a lot of like really beautiful moments with it. But yeah, it's led to some funny interactions at times as well. In addition to that, I've kept up with playing some classical music here and there over the years, but largely what I'm doing these days is it's mostly playing traditional jazz and working on my own music. I do a lot of songwriting that I'd like to work on getting an album together one of these days as a solo thing, and I've got some stuff I'm not quite ready to talk about yet, but I'll get there. And doing a lot of stuff, kind of experimental music stuff with churches and different things. Because one of the things that I think Vancouver is really lacking at present is any sort of third spaces. I was telling you just before we started recording that I got back from New York on late Monday night, and you can't go more than 3 blocks without throwing a stone and hitting a park. Whereas in Vancouver, we have some nice parks and stuff, but they tend to be quite isolated, often only in the neighborhoods of higher economic brackets. And meanwhile, most Vancouverites have become, and for a long time have been, quite secular. So we have all these churches and empty religious buildings, as well as community halls and different things that are sitting empty. And so there's this real need for places where people can come together. And I think this is where a part of what Brian's been doing with Brentwood has been so successful, is just trying to open up the building for the usage of the community. Yeah, he's one of the biggest supporters of big bands, in the scene right now, because of the big bands that rehearse there and the big band concerts that have happened.
Yeah, I got him onto that.
Okay. Tell me about that.
They'd largely been doing small ensembles at the time. And we started a big band that was sponsored by the church. And for different reasons, I decided to close that project. And then I moved on to St. Andrews Wesley. But because of that connection, as well as Dan Reynolds' support and of course Brian's interest and just that church in general, they were able to get like the infrastructure together to do that, and a number of those connections were made. So yeah, that started when I was there. But the jazz connection at Brentwood, I think, goes back at least about 15 years now, 12, 13, 14
That's how long
years.
he said he's been there-ish, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's still absolutely happening. I think the big bands I associate with there, in a lot of ways, the leading ladies with the Jam series, Isabel Leong's Ghibli Jazz Orchestra, which is now going out and playing other places too. Dean's big band at some point, they had their big gig this year at the Fox, but I've heard them there as well. And so there's this generation of big bands that space is supporting in such a big way.
Yeah.
So let's talk about here. So we've heard a lot about the lead up and you coming to Brentwood and you being there. Now, what starts to shift so that you end up coming here, and what is coming here? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I'd been at Brentwood just shy of 5 years, working there, I think, for about 4. Must have been about 4 years. And I'd been in school for a little while and was spending more and more of my time, in field education and classes, and getting quite involved with my master's degree. And as I was doing so, although I'd been in the Presbyterian Church for 4 or 5 years, it wasn't quite the fit for me. I have a great love and respect for the Presbyterian Church and its tradition, but in many ways, Brentwood is quite a progressive outlier. And through my field ed placements, I was increasingly spending more and more time with the United Church, which is one of the historical influences behind Jazz Vespers in Canada, producing people like Oscar Peterson, amongst others, but also folks like Diana Krall, and in this area, people that had strong connections as well were like Jody Prosnick and Jennifer Scott, and like there's a whole series of generations that came through. And so I just found that in the United Church there was this much greater openness to the arts and to jazz, to more progressive ways of understanding the faith. The social activism of the United Church is much more pronounced than other denominations, being the first to ordain women to become pastors, which is still a big deal in the Christian world, and the second in the world to fully accept and ordain gay and lesbian members, later extend to the full LGBTQIA plus 2S plus community. So I was just becoming closer to that. And then I was playing more Jazz Vespers, which are much more common in the United Church around here. In a funny turn of events, I needed a field ed placement. So I took one at Northwood United in Surrey, where they had a jazz program that had kind of gone dormant because of COVID, as well one of their founding people had passed, had died. And so they needed someone to kind of come in, restart the program, get all the musicians lined up, the volunteers, everything. And so I did that. And funny turn of events, and I knew this going into it, was that Scott Turnbrook, Reverend Scott Turnbrook, is the son of Gordon Turner, who brought Jazz Vespers to
you
St.
mentioned
Andrews
off the top.
Wesley. So I came into church land through Brian Fraser, who was best friends with Gordon Turner, and then I was formed at Northwood by Gordon Turner's son. And then I came. Eventually, there was a job posting for St. Andrews Wesley for the youth and young adult minister, and so I came here and took that position last January. And about 4 or 5 months into it, I got a phone call from Jamie Croyle. And I'd grown up listening to Jamie Croyle and Dal's big band with Diane Lines. And I gigged with Jamie once before he died, and I've gigged with Diane Lines a few times. And so Jamie had called me, and it was clear that he was in the last couple months, up to a year of his life. Originally, when he called me, he'd said that he'd only had a couple months, but he ended up being with us. I think it was for at least another 8 months, which was a huge thing for the scene, for people to be able to have the time to say their goodbyes. And he went out with such class. But yeah, the two of us, the three of us went and we had lunch and handed things over, and it was this. We had this like really special moment where Dan had gotten up to go pay the bill, and I said, Jamie, I don't want to make this weird, but like I grew up listening to your records and with Dal Richards and Diane Lyons, who I mentioned I've gigged with. And I said, I don't mean to make this weird, but it's really special to take over, not just this program, but to take it over from you. And he was just like, yeah, man, it's really great. And so I took over booking and running the program here, and I've been doing that now for over a year, which has been really, really exciting to be at the big cathedral doing that, especially the historic cathedral that started things here. And it's just such a full circle moment between, my connections at Brentwood and Northwood and St. Andrews Wesley. One of the things that, that's really amazing with these types of programs and ministries that can last for decades is the ways that they form these small, circuitous connections. A program that was started 4 years before I was born would later profoundly affect my life in my early 20s, like at a different church. But I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about both church and jazz traditions. They've been handed down to us from people we may or may have not met, through many generations. And it instills in us a sense of something that's much larger.
Totally. So now that we are here, I'm still keeping up with pretty much every person who books jazz at least once a week has been on this show. So, I've heard different conversations about people's experiences with booking artists and whether or not it was what they expected or not. You've been doing that here for a good year now. What's it like for you being a booker of music in a unique environment, different than if I asked this to Corey or Tim or Bonnie or whoever, right? But how's that part of it specifically been for you?
Yeah, it's been interesting. Being at the big United Church Cathedral downtown doing Jazz Vespers it's an odd thing. There's people who really understand what we're trying to do here. There's people who think of this as just like a free show in a pretty place, which it's not. There's been a lot of shifts that we've been trying to make down here in terms of programmatically what we're looking for from our performers, as well as trying to connect with younger generations in the city. And so there's been a lot of learning curves. We're currently just at the point where we've been putting a hold on our bookings. I'm just about to resume booking for the rest of this calendar year, and we're making a bunch of changes on our end internally. We're really trying to move into this phase where traditionally Jazz Vespers was conceived of in the 1960s as being a church for musicians. It started with I forget his first name, Reverend Garcia from St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran. And it was largely because New York musicians were working till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And they were still from the generation where most of them would have considered themselves Christian to some degree. And so they took this kind of Christian practice of Vespers, which is rooted in a Jewish evening prayer, and did it in such a way that the musicians could come and offer their gifts, and the broader church could be a part of it. And that's changed a lot. Already by the 90s, that approach had shifted, and it was becoming more of a paid gig, especially as less and less musicians in the society was thinking of itself as less explicitly Christian. And here we are now in the 2020s, where the CBC just released a study that people in the Gen Z, younger millennial cohort are approximately about like 6 to 12% Christian. And of that, maybe 4% attend church. So
the 4% of the 6%?
The 4% of the 6 to 12. It's very low. It's very low, which I think is actually a really good thing, but that's maybe not so much for a jazz podcast. So it's changed a lot. And for quite a period from the 90s until recently, the format of what Jazz Vespers became was less and less a church service and more of the musicians come and play what they want. And it would kind of connect somehow with some bit of scripture or a teaching or a reflection by the minister. That approach is one that's still widely used at many churches. The problem is what it relies on is this kind of like broad understanding of both jazz and Christian tradition. So, there was a time where you could reference you could reference, say, something like the Good Samaritan, and people would kind of vaguely know what it was about. Nowadays, you can't really do that. And it's the same with jazz. There was a time you could say to a large swath of Canadians like Oscar Peterson, and they'd be like, yeah, I know who that is. And that's not really the case anymore either. So the direction we're moving into at St. Andrews Wesley is trying to cultivate themes with the performers that the ministers can speak to. So whether it's like picking a certain performer and doing a showcase of their tunes, and then looking at themes from their life and music that the minister can preach to, or picking a theme like love, or recently we had Kristen Fung for Pentecost, and she did this like awesome electronic thing where she picked all tunes about fire, which was great. It was so great. But what we're trying to do is to find these little nuggets where there's overlap between spirituality and music in the broadest sense possible. And so we've also been trying to invite more performers from other faith backgrounds or no faith background, as well as I'm currently just in the process of developing our kind of mandate for hiring diverse performers at Jazz Vespers, diverse in terms of age, sexuality, gender, religious background, so that Jazz Vespers doesn't become a byproduct of the 60s through 90s, but is working for contemporary Canadians in Vancouver.
That's such a smart point about you can't reference jazz and assume people know it, and you couldn't quote like a scripture or a story and that people would know it. I love the way you put that. Was so good.
Yeah, well, and I mean, like, it's funny. Like right now, we're seeing like a lot of jazz performers, and it's quite common at Jazz Vespers now. People will play like a Beatles tune, or they'll play like an 80s tune in a jazz style. And when you listen to those tunes, like, it's very clear that the connection to jazz and popular music is diverging faster and faster, with the rise of electronic music and sampling, and the fact that jazz has become quite gentrified and Black culture has moved, in some ways, mainstream Black culture has moved further away from jazz tradition as it's become whitewashed. So, there's this real attempt. Like, to me, one of the worst things about Jazz Vespers is when you go in and the minister's like droning on some version of like their Sunday morning sermon, and then someone just keeps playing Body and Soul. Like, it needs, for me, for it to be really an immersive experience. Like, I want to hear some sort of teaching that's connecting the music with what's going on in life, contemporary society. And I want to hear music that's been really well crafted, whether it's people's original tunes or whether it's like the suites that Brentwood has been pushing for, like Dean Teeson's Good Samaritan Suite, which is awesome. They did that here a little while ago. we're just at this time where there's so much going on that our performances really, really need to matter. Our worship services really, really need to matter, or else it's just part of the overload and the static chaos that's going around.
Yeah. So the format, how can we like run down the format of what it typically looks like now for somebody who hasn't gone before? Because I know it's different than the Brentwood one that I would know better too. I've been to both, but let's just run that down so that there's an image of that for somebody who hasn't.
So at St. Andrews Wesley, we do things a little bit more liturgically involved. Liturgical literally means work of the people from Greek liturgia. And it's a way in which churches organize services. So, we have a welcome, and then we do 2 tunes. There's a short bit of scripture, a first teaching, 2 tunes, another bit of scripture. And then the second half of the service goes between tune, prayer, offering and prayer, tune, benediction, closing tune. Just to keep it back and forth. Some churches like Brentwood, as well as Trinity Grace United, I think some of the ones on the North Shore, they'll use a simpler version where it's like an opening, 4 songs, reflection, 4 songs, benediction, close. Which really works for I think smaller congregations because it lets musicians really get in a flow. I've been at churches I've done the opposite, where it's tune, reflection, tune, reflection, tune, reflection, and it's like whiplash for the musicians because you don't know what's going on, and the minister gets a couple words in, and then the musicians, like, their instruments get cold, and so I've tried to split the difference a little bit, and it's been really working for us down here. What our clergy at St. Andrews Wesley have been trying to do is to reflect closely on the music, and then find those through moments. And so there's been some really great Vespers that have stuck out in my mind. Like we had one, I think it was last fall, where Emmett Hatlilid came in and he did his interpretations of Emily Dickinson tunes. And it was awesome. Like there was a ton of people there. People were really engaged. Emily Dickinson, of course, it draws upon religious themes as well. We did one where Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan and I preached on the Jewish connection with jazz music, and Saul Burson was playing tunes of the Jewish American Songbook, and trying to find these moments where what we're really trying to do is, decolonize the space and have it open for all people in a way that's honoring the land, that's honoring the different traditions, the different bodies that are coming into the space, so that they can share their gifts.
So you have to know probably what the musician is going to play in advance, because you have to integrate the rest of the service into that to match what you're trying to accomplish here that you just described.
Yeah, there's different approaches. Like when I preach Jazz Vespers, I don't use notes. I generally, because it's what I was formed in, and it's like my 2 backgrounds. I just kind of, like, I might I'll pick some sort of scripture ahead of time, and I'll meditate and pray on it. But I don't typically spend too much time writing. Others, though, really find they have to, and that's okay. It just leads to different results. It's like, when you play tunes, and some guys are into 3 composed charts, and others are like, show up the tunes in F minor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's standards especially. And then, if somebody's bringing in originals, that's interesting too. It's like that would be an interesting consideration for what you would have to prepare for the rest of the service. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you could find out pretty easily right off the bat, like what the themes that artist is kind of about are.
Yeah.
So it's not like you have to really dig into the music necessarily. You can probably determine what you need to.
Well,
pretty
and
easily.
we do everything. We talk over email and we contract things and whatnot. But sometimes it's fun to throw the form out the window. We had one gig. I think it was February, for Black History Month, and we had George Washington Lee come out from Ohio, and we did this just free jazz thing where someone would ring a bell, and then we would draw from the basket a mixture of quotes, like everything from like Looney Tunes to the Bible to like the Quran, writings by Young, and we would just improvise, and it was awesome. It was so great. And his mom was there, who's a member of our congregation, Ada Lee, who toured with Ellington back in the day, and we've done a few concerts with her as well that have just been amazing. Yeah,
throwing the form out the window is very important. That's in the jazz tradition. That's for sure. That's a theme. I see the Ada Lee record here. In your office. Yeah, one of the one of the joys about being a pastor is like a lot of the time you are working with people, but sometimes they end up like pastoring you. And Ada's been like that in my life. I was just over there before I went to New York, and we were having coffee at her place, and you walk in and there's photos of her with Count Basie having dinner, and she's shown me, for example, like dresses that Sarah Vaughan gave her. Wow.
There's of course, like the signed photos of Ellington she has from when she played the Apollo Theater. And anybody that comes and plays Jazz Vespers knows that if Ada's there, she sits, if you're facing the front of the church, she sits on the left-hand side, 2 seats in, and we'll go up to every performer after and tell them exactly what she thinks.
Okay.
Which I, as a musician, I love. As a pastor and venue organizer, sometimes I have to rescue performers. But it's really amazing to have a church that has these connections, and we've had others. We have others in our congregation who are stalwarts of the Vancouver jazz scene as well. That is similarly come, and they've been voices to help pass the tradition down to others.
It's an interesting place for you to have arrived. You talk about the journey to the city, and now you're right here. You're downtown, and you're bringing people together here. So it's a funny position. You've also talked about like different things that you felt like you couldn't escape from in your life. Like Brentwood kept showing up, and then this other thing kept showing up, and it's an interesting way to look at it. It's like you perceive that something is calling to you, and then even if you know it's inevitable, you're like not quite there yet, but then at some point you just go there, right? It's an interesting way that you've described a few different things like that.
Yeah. I think if because I am coming up, like you've pointed out, on 10 years of being in the city, I think if I'd asked a younger version of myself where I would have ended up, I wouldn't have remotely thought of being here. I also I don't think I would have, as a child, thought I would have been into like New Orleans style jazz.
Right.
But like so much of life just, there's these invitations, and you either accept them or you reject them. And then once you're into one of those streams, especially if you've accepted something, there's a lot of effort that comes with working on the craft and developing it. And it takes you funny places. And there's been some really like cool moments. Like one time I was in Atlanta for a church conference, and part of this organization called the Forum for Theological Education, which is for young church leaders under the age of 30. And I went there, and they was just talking with a bunch of people and stuff, and they're like, "Do you want to come play with the choir?" And I was like, Sure. I mean, like I can sing in choir. I don't love singing parts. It's just I'm not great at it. I don't love it. But I was like, sure, I did it, and I ended up playing a bunch of clarinet with them, and ended up playing like a bunch of these like Southern gospel tunes with like Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is one of the major bishops of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Martin Luther King Jr.'s denomination. And she was the first openly ordained lesbian woman in the United States. And had like some conversations with her. And it's like these moments where it's like, oh, like this is all kind of come together. Like I'm playing clarinet in Georgia and doing these like really cool things. And then there's other times, you know, you play gigs and you just put your horn in the case after and you go like, never want to play again. And someone caught that on video.
Oh man. Yeah, the invitations. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a good way to sum it up, is that you perceive these invitations coming to you and then at some point you accept them. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. There's one specific musical memory I have of hearing you play this year, and it was the Robbie Burns Jazz Evensong at Brentwood, where you did something that's very dear to my heart, which is you mixed the traditional folk music of the British Isles with jazz, which is something that I very much love. That is right in my bag. And I enjoyed hearing you do that. You sang, you played, you curated a fun lineup of music there. Reflect on that a little bit. It's been a few months. What was that like? This is January, right? Of course, because Robbie Burns Day.
It's funny. It's the second one of those I've done. It's one of the, I tend to be quite a serious person in a lot of ways. I think it just, you know, I think part of the reason I like traditional jazz is because it helps me lighten up.
Break the ice, yeah.
It helps me break the ice. But Brian's of Scottish descent. My dad's from the Highlands as well. And we talked about doing this for a number of years. And actually, this goes back a long ways. I did a lot of research on this. There was a lot of swinging tunes from Scotland in the 30s. And I can point you to some recordings. I just can't remember them off the top of my head. And so I decided to get this band together. And it was like, we're going to get people of all partial Scottish descent. And I arranged these tunes out. And it's funny, out of all the stuff I've done, this is like one of the ones that people keep referencing. Even though I've done bigger things and whatnot. And I think we're gonna do it again at Brentwood this coming January. But I also want to do one at St. Andrews Wesley here. And the music director here, her name is Angelique Poe, and she's a very dear friend and colleague, and she's of Chinese descent. And we want to do a Gung Hagus Fat Choi, where we're gonna do Robbie Burns tune as well as Chinese Lunar New Year.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Because we've got a diverse congregation and want to open that up. So that's on the list of things for the future as well.
So I forget who was in that band in January. Who were those people that you assembled?
Todd Stewart.
Yeah.
Casey Tolhurst, who I've played a lot with. And Miles Black. Miles Black, by the way, is of matrilineal descent from Robbie Burns.
That's right. That was
one
brought
of Burns' daughters.
Wow.
Yeah. Huh. Which I did not know, but it makes sense for his musicality.
Well, yes. I was at Brentwood Jazz Evensong this past week, and he played saxophone. That's the first time I heard him play saxophone.
The guy knows no bounds.
Yeah, can play anything.
I think we need all of us in the scene need a sign that says like Miles Black's coming for our gig.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. He's great. He's a fantastic musician, wonderful person.
Yeah. I like the crossover plans for St. Andrews Wesley, because maybe the Lunar New Year timing is going to be closer. Yeah, I mean it's always kind of close, right?
It's always kind of late
this year. Yeah. That'd be good.
Yeah, and I think in terms of other gigs and stuff, I've got a couple of weeks coming off of time coming up here at St. Andrews Wesley, and I'm going to take a break. And one of the things I've really been wanting to do is just sit down and write out a bunch of swing charts, head charts. I've been to New York a couple times this year and been playing with people on the scene. And there was a time, especially when I first moved to the city, there was enough traditional jazz players that like we kind of knew all of these different endings and whatnot that you could kind of just call them and cue them on the fly.
Oh yeah.
In a way that modern jazz has this as well, but more niche, more specific. And a lot of those players have moved moved on, and I'm starting to look around and I'm going, oh wait, I'm I'm one of the older ones now.
You're still holding those arrangements in your head, right?
Yeah, I'm still holding a lot of these arrangements in my head. And so it's time to start writing some of these arrangements out. And I really want to do, in addition to the kind of the song stuff I've been writing, the originals, I want to do just like a really swinging album. I've been listening a lot to Kenny DeVerne lately. Do you know?
No.
Kenny DeVerne was he played tenor and clarinet and came up in the late Benny Goodman bands. There was a stint of time where rock was so popular, Benny Goodman actually closed his band in the 60s through 70s, and he managed hotels. Actually came and briefly worked for the Hotel Vancouver. A lot of people don't know this. He was trying to figure out how to run hotels, so he came to Vancouver. Anyways, Kenny DeVerne came up in those bands and stuff alongside people like Kempa Pawlowski and others, and it has like these really great albums from the 90s, and I think I want to do something in that vein that's would capture some of the kind of traditional jazz love affair that British Columbia has had with that part of the music.
Yeah, that would be very special because it would continue to develop that link with the people who've moved away, and then you'll keep collaborating with them, of course, too. So yeah, that makes sense. That's an interesting role for you as well, where it's like you're between two things. You participated in what you feel like you mentioned is an era that closed, and now you are observing the current state of things, and you have an opportunity to do something there that brings what you know into the present. So that's interesting, and that makes a lot of sense for me because I remember some of the people from that past era and the swing and trad jazz side of the scene right now. I mean, it's something that I put on the gig list when I can keep track of it, but it's one of the areas that I don't know as well. So that would be cool for me to hear that project whenever the time is right, and feel the connection there. I think there's a bunch of trad jazz stuff happening around the Jazz Fest coming up. Like it's not an official Jazz Fest. It's not part of the coastal jazz programming, but there's a lot in Yaletown. Yeah. There's a lot of trad jazz events coming up that happen, especially throughout the first week of Jazz Fest, right? Are you participating in that?
Yeah, I'm part of the I've got a gig in a couple of weeks. I think it's the 13th for the Yaletown BIA for the I forget what it's called. It's the one down in Bill Curtis Square where they put all the umbrellas upside down, and it's really a fun gig. I haven't played that gig since I was probably like 18 or 19.
Oh wow.
And when I did last time, both Jeff Claridge and Joe Abbott showed up at the gig.
Clarinet showdown.
And it was funny because, Joe is only a year or two older than me, and, been playing for around the same amount of time. But Jeff is, I think he's about 10 years older. And I just remember talking with one of my friends. I was like, did I do okay? And someone was like, no, you got your ass handed to you by Jeff. It's just really funny. But Jeff and I have a really good relationship. And I hope some fun stuff like that happens. One of the things I love about playing the clarinet in jazz is it's, I play saxophone and flute as well, but really I'm a clarinet player. Is it's a niche instrument within jazz, which has already become sidelined, and it's always had this, it had its heyday from the 1910s to the mid 40s, and basically since then it's shown up either as a throwback instrument or in some weird progressive music here and there, or symphonic type jazz third stream. But it really breeds this sense of community. Like, I can probably name most of the professional clarinet players in the
players, yeah.
city, and we all kind of know each other, and we never get to play with each other. And so when we do, it's normally quite a big deal. I had a gig with Colin Farquhar a little while ago, and he was on a lot of those early 51st State Big Bang jazz recordings with Evan Arnson and Jen Hodge and all them. And it ended up being him and I, and then Jerry Green showed up, who used to play with, I got to get this right, the Phoenix Jazzers and what was their Grand Dominion Jazz Band, which was a bunch of British, Canadian, American expats on either side of the border that used to tour like all over the world. And then like a couple of other more amateur type players. There was like 5 of us on stage playing clarinet, and I was like, and they say jazz is dead. Although, you know, having 5 clarinet players on stage might actually kill someone. So.
That's so funny that you mentioned the clarinet camaraderie, because I was thinking about, trombone players must be like that too. But there's an important difference, which is trombone players get to play with each other all the time because there's 4 of them in a big band section, or 3 or 4. And so that's a subtle difference in what otherwise is probably a good comparison there.
Yeah. And I mean, other than in some of like the Ellington charts or more contemporarily, like people like Maria Schneider, mostly you're not getting dedicated clarinet players playing together. It's mostly saxophone players who whine about playing the instrument, and rightfully so. It's not a very hospitable instrument. There's this age-old joke about, you know, the clarinet was designed by committee by 3 people who never met in person. It's not an even instrument. It's for viewers that have musical theory background, unlike the saxophone or flute, which are built on the octave. So you play one fingering low register and it comes out a perfect octave above. The clarinet's built on 12ths, which is a bizarre interval to begin with, to build your instrument upon. And then, you know, unlike Adolph Sax inventing the saxophone, where it was a very intentional instrument and was meant to have a very accessible fingering system, the clarinet was chromaticized from various reed pipes. And so it's this strange instrument that has these low woody tones and shrill flute-like upper tones, and uses 3 fingerings, 3.5 fingering systems, which has the effect of, and if you talk to most reed players, most clarinet players are better saxophone players than saxophone players are clarinet players, just because of the simplified fingerings. Yeah,
I buy that. You have a clarinet desk lamp here in your office. Was that designed by committee by 3 people who never met?
No, that was designed by my dad.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
My dad actually made 2 of them and presented them both to me. He's like, I get to have one, and you get to have one. And like a typical boomer, everything at my dad's house is he's got a Google Home. And so he always says like, okay, Google, turn off clarinet, and the light turns off, which is just so funny to me.
He's got it customized.
Yeah.
Wow. It's tall too. I mean, it's like a full size.
It's a full clarinet.
Full size clarinet body. Yeah, on this kind of tall desk lamp. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's I love the instrument I play. I've dabbled in other instruments here and there. I think if I was ever to put some serious time into another instrument, the one I would choose at this point would probably be the sousaphone. Yeah. I really want to get into playing the sousaphone, and I've seen a few people do it, and you know, I'm already a wind player, so I've got that bonus. But other than that, the other big goal in terms of instruments is I want to get a bass sax, and I want to play the bass sax like Adrian Rollini. Do you know?
No.
Adrian Rollini played bass sax on a lot of the Big Spiderbeck and Frankie Trumbauer recordings in the 20s and 30s. And he would only ever sit, and he would sit and he'd play the bass sax, and with his like left foot he'd play a hi-hat, and everything was like these, you know, 2 feels kind of in these Sousa rag march styles. And actually he had a profound influence as a soloist on Frankie Trumbauer, who was the primary influence on Lester Young.
Huh.
So there's that lineage, and I'd really like to explore that and get some gigs. My friends always tease me that they're like, yeah, it's going to take you 10 years before you pay it off, but so is jazz.
Yeah.
Such as jazz. Other than that, I think the my focus of practicing for this summer and what I've been playing a lot of recently at gigs is I've been doing a lot of Sidney Bechet tunes and trying to get into the tunes that he wrote, and they're really interesting tunes like Viper Mad and Sweet Louisiana and Promenade aux Champs-Élysées, and just really trying to inhabit that almost proto swing mentality, the heavy vibrato, the expressionism of it, which through reading and studies is deeply connected with his experience of being a biracial man in the United States and a French speaker from Louisiana who moved to France. Not a great character. Was part of the reason he moved there is because he was convicted of sexual assault in the United States, and then moved over to Europe, partially in order to avoid charges, but they might have been fabricated, which is a whole other thing to get into. One of the things that's interesting about jazz is, and this is actually very similar to being a minister in church, is there's a lot of very difficult, challenging parts of the history. It's very rare that, you get a figure that's, all saint or all sinner. People will point to figures like Stan Getz, and they'll be like, wow, his music, and he changed our phrasing and musicality. But like, he regularly beat his wife and probably would be diagnosed with BPD nowadays. Or they'll point to, Miles Davis. And I mean, we don't need to get into all of that. Or people too, like I've known about 4 people who played with Benny Goodman, who I won't say their names on record, but they were like, he was a terrible, like awful human being. Judgmental, difficult, total taskmaster, all of that. And yet, here we are in the early 2020s in a very racially diverse city that is playing this historically Black art form far from any of its geographical roots. Although there are some exceptions, like with people like Jelly Roll Morton that lived here in the 1910s and early 20s. And so there's like, for me, there's both this opportunity to take the music in a really uplifting and positive direction in a time where we're seeing a lot of apathy in the city and in Canadian society in general, and a chance to really unpack some of the historical legacy and weight of this music. So increasingly, when I'm playing tunes and stuff, like I especially because I'm part of the traditional jazz scene largely, I'm trying to follow in the steps of people like Alan Matheson, who are not only great players and wonderful people, but are also like historians and teachers of the scene, and that acknowledge the difficult legacies of heteronormativity and white supremacy within a Black art form.
Yeah. Alan is somebody that you mentioned already, and is such a great keeper of the torch for so many of us. Yeah. It's somebody that I encountered when I was very young too, and I have a lot of respect for. As somebody who will 99.9% chance to listen to this. So
perhaps.
I think that's a really thoughtful note to start wrapping it on. Is there anything else you want to say about jazz and church, or is there anything else you'd like to bring up to take us out here that you don't think we've hit on already?
This is my big moment, perhaps, my cadenza. I think what I'd like to say is that when we look at the jazz scene, the way that it's shifting and changing right now in Vancouver, I think we're really experiencing a city that's starting to come into its own. Vancouver has really struggled for a long time to have a sense of identity in which a lot of other cities have had just a stronger sense. When you take like Montreal, for example, there's this longstanding French background, large English Canadian influence, many immigrants over the years. Toronto, and you look at Vancouver, and Vancouver is often rightly pointed out as one of Canada's leading cities of immigrants. It's often pointed out as being very West Coast, and that's about it. Whereas in what we're seeing in the jazz scene right now is, I think, a real explosion of the different types of musics and peoples and cultures that are coming here and are finally actually starting to produce things that are like from Vancouver, which is really exciting to see people coming from all over the world. If there's, one thing that I can hope for the church is that it would be a part of that it would be a place, especially in the United Church, which is this long history of social activism and progressivity and is committed to becoming an intercultural church, that it would support and encourage all those places and become a lightning rod for everything from like the things we're celebrating in the city, things like Jazz Fest and the work that we're seeing like Tim and Corey and others doing, to lightning rods when we're deeply upset about things like the children that were discovered in Kamloops, or when we look at different social and socio-ecological crises, such as, like we're coming up to forest fire season. So jazz has this long history of walking with people and helping them express themselves. And I hope that a place like St. Andrews Wesley can continue to do that and come alongside people as well.
Well, that's what you're up to. That's what you're doing. So I appreciate you a lot. I had a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, and I know I will continue to learn a lot from you. So thanks for everything that you do, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Will.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Rhythm Changes podcast. If you enjoyed it, become a member for free today at rhythmchanges.ca. You will get the free weekly email. You'll get a very thick one for Jazz Fest if you join up now, because there's 300 gigs on the gig list in June, and a lot of them are this coming week. But we also send out all the album reviews and other content we do from the contributors and myself at Rhythm Changes. And I will catch you again in future Jazz Fest episodes coming up real soon. Thanks.